My name is Jasmine Parker, and the night my life snapped in half started with a metal door slamming in my face. My brother had just shoved me into Dad's garage over an argument about the business, and I did the one thing he never expected. I smiled when the lock clicked. He thought he'd planned every detail. He'd cleared my calendar, taken my phone, and told everyone I was out of town. The garage in Jacksonville was sealed tight, no windows, no water, just Dad's old work truck and the thick, wet heat pressing against my skin. The concrete soaked up the cold from the night, and the air tasted like rust and gasoline. He told me no one knew I was there, and that by the time anyone started asking questions, it would be too late. For him, this was simple math. 24 hours alone in the dark for me, and a clean path to Dad's company for him. The first hours were noise and pain, fists against steel, breathing too fast, counting every minute like it might be my last. Then the panic burned off, and the part of me that had survived every bad day in that business woke up. If he wanted 24 hours, I would use every second. Somewhere in that garage, and in 2 words I hadn't spoken yet, was the one thing he hadn't calculated. The thing that could turn his perfect plan into a confession. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. A little while before that night, everything in my life still looked organized on paper. My dad, Russell Parker, ran a steady logistics company out of Jacksonville. I had grown up in the warehouses and dispatch room, learning how to read a schedule and keep trucks moving long before I understood balance sheets. By the time I was in my late 20s, I was running daily operations. He called my older brother, Ethan Parker, his future partner, even when Ethan barely showed up. When Dad's heart stopped without warning, the company didn't pause with him. Routes still had to be covered, drivers still wanted answers, invoices still went out. I buried myself in work. Ethan moved differently. He was suddenly everywhere he had ignored before, showing up at the office, asking about revenue, acting like every question about contracts was his by right. The reading of the will took place in a small conference room. Our family attorney, Thomas Ellery, sat at the head of the table with a thin folder in front of him. I sat on one side, Ethan on the other. Ellery cleared his throat and explained how Dad had structured things. The company itself would stay in the family, but day-to-day control and final decisions would rest with me. Ethan would keep a minority stake and receive a separate inheritance. Dad had put into writing what he'd been doing quietly for years, trusting me with the moving parts and trusting Ethan with as little structure as possible. Ethan didn't explode in that room. He didn't shout or shove the chair back. He just leaned back and smiled in a way that made my skin tighten. Ellery asked if we had questions. I asked about procedures, insurance, bank authorizations. Ethan only wanted to know how soon changes could be made, how flexible the arrangement was, what it would take to rewrite certain clauses. When we left the building, the air hit like warm water. Ethan walked beside me instead of in front of me, too close and too casual. He talked about how exhausting Dad's company would be to run, how many legal headaches I would inherit, how risky it was to stay responsible if anything went wrong on the road. I knew enough about our risk profile to recognize the speech for what it was. A sales pitch. I told him I could handle it. He said he believed me, but the way he watched my face made it clear he was measuring how much pressure I could take. He started planting small ideas disguised as concern. I could always step back, he said. Let someone more experienced with negotiations and liability take the heat. I had been dealing with claims and delays for years. Ethan just hadn't noticed. Inside the office later that week, the tone changed. Ethan stopped pretending he was there to help. He began walking through the halls like he already owned the building. Drivers who barely knew him started calling him boss because he corrected them whenever they used the wrong title. I corrected their paperwork, not their words, because I thought the truth on the page would be enough. That was when Bethany Cross pulled me aside. Bethany had been our office manager since I was a teenager. She knew every invoice, every vendor, every driver's habit. Her desk sat in the corner of the main room and nothing slipped past her. She told me, quietly, that Ethan had asked for access to systems he'd never touched before. Payment portals, vendor profiles, old contracts Dad had stored but never fully digitized. I wanted to believe Ethan was finally taking responsibility. Bethany's expression told me she did not share that optimism. She had seen too many accounts go bad because someone ambitious wanted shortcuts. She advised me to document everything, to make sure any access granted to Ethan left a trace. I didn't know yet that Ethan was already building a story in the background, a story where I was careless with money, reckless with approvals, an obstacle he needed to remove for the good of the business. I just knew that the air in the office felt different when he walked in, like everyone had to pick a side they didn't understand. When he suggested we have lunch to talk like adults about the future of the company, I agreed. I told myself it was better to sit across from him in daylight than let his plans grow in silence. I assumed the worst thing he could do was try to push a contract in front of me, something I could refuse or take to Ellery. I walked into that choice thinking I still understood my brother, and that belief felt safer than admitting I might not. He chose a place on the river where the servers already knew his drink order. I took that as the first bad sign. At lunch, Ethan talked in slow, polished circles. He never asked directly for control of the company. Instead, he stacked worries on the table: liability, fuel costs, driver turnover, regulatory fines. Each ordinary problem became a looming catastrophe I could not manage. When he floated the idea of stepping in more officially, it sounded like a script he had rehearsed. I kept my answers tight. I told him I knew the routes, the margins, and the people who actually kept the trucks moving. I was the one who stayed late when storms hit or ports backed up. What I did not understand was why my brother, who had always avoided the messy part of the business, suddenly had time to list every reason I should fear the job I already did. When the check came, he took it without glancing at the total, a quiet reminder that he wanted to be seen as the one covering the bill. Outside, he walked me to my car and said he was glad we had started the conversation. The phrase sounded harmless, but it felt like a line he planned to repeat later, proof that he had tried to be reasonable. The real pressure began the next week. Bethany came into my office early one morning carrying a stack of printouts instead of her usual coffee mug. She closed the door before she sat down. Her eyes were alert when she said changes had been made in our payment system overnight. New vendors had appeared in the database with names that blended in with our regular suppliers. Small transfers had been approved, just under the threshold that would trigger review. Every approval carried my credentials. The log showed my account. She spread the pages across my desk. Some transfers were time-stamped at hours when I knew I had been asleep. Others lined up with meetings where Bethany herself had been sitting across from me. She had checked the system twice before coming in. There was no technical glitch. Someone with access had used my profile or created activity that would look like I had. My throat went dry as I watched her finger trace the entries. I thought about the way Ethan had been hovering near her desk, asking about old records and talking about cleaning up Dad's loose ends. I thought about the questions he had aimed at Ellery concerning structure and obstacles. The path between those moments and the pages in front of me was not yet evidence, but it ran in a straight line. Bethany suggested we document everything quietly. We saved copies of the logs, printed reports, and highlighted transfers that did not match any real invoice. She locked the originals in her own cabinet. Twice that day I walked down the hall, meaning to confront Ethan, and turned back before his door. Accusations without proof would only give him a chance to frame the conversation in his own language. That evening, Ethan called my extension before I shut down my computer. His tone was light, almost casual. He said he had been reviewing numbers and that a few irregularities had caught his eye. He was concerned about how things might look if anyone else saw them. If I wanted, he could help clean it up, but it would require some authorizations. Nothing major, just signatures to keep everything internal. I agreed to meet, not to sign. By then, a colder understanding had taken hold. The company my father had built could be turned into a weapon against me with a handful of manipulated entries, and my brother already had his hands on the keyboard. If he reached Ellery first with a curated stack of documents, the burden would land on me to prove that the picture was distorted. The next day, Ethan asked me to stop by the house where we had grown up. He said it would be easier to talk there, away from phones and interruptions. It sounded like a sentimental choice. After closing the office, I still found myself driving toward the old neighborhood. The driveway looked narrower than it had when I was a child. The house itself had barely changed. I sat in my car long enough for the engine to cool, telling myself I could listen without letting Ethan rewrite the story. When I finally walked up the front steps and rang the bell, I was still trying to decide whether I trusted my own instincts more than the paper he wanted Ellery to see. The door opened on the second ring. Ethan stood there in a pressed shirt and rolled sleeves, looking like he had stepped out of a meeting instead of our childhood kitchen. He moved aside without a word and let me walk in first. The familiar hallway smelled like dust and lemon cleaner, and for a second I could almost believe we were just back for a holiday visit, not standing on the edge of a fight over everything Dad left behind. He had already set the table, not with food, but with paper. Stacks of printouts, a legal pad, a pen placed neatly on top. He gestured toward the chair where Dad used to sit and took the one opposite. The imbalance was deliberate. He wanted the head of the table and the story that came with it. He started talking about the company the way Ellery might have in a briefing. Soft voice, controlled pace, heavy words. He said he had pulled some numbers to understand our risk and that a few patterns worried him. Payments that did not match the usual vendors, transfers that looked like short-term loans, approvals coming from my credentials at odd hours. He said if an auditor walked in tomorrow, they would not care how hard I worked. They would see signatures and screen captures, not the years I had spent on loading docs and dispatch calls. As he spoke, he spread the pages between us. I recognized the account layout but not the specific moves. Transactions I had never authorized now sat in front of me with my name pinned to them. The effect was surgical. Every printout cut at the same angle. A line item, a timestamp, my user ID. Ethan said someone might think I was careless with access. Someone might say I had blurred company money and personal expenses. He said he did not believe that, not really, but others might. He never raised his voice. He did not have to. The picture on the table did his work for him. I asked where he had gotten the reports. He said he had logged in to double-check something Bethany mentioned, then found more than he expected. He called it a mess we needed to handle before Ellery or a bank officer saw it. He repeated that phrase, handle it, like it meant protection instead of leverage. The proposal came disguised as help. If I signed a set of documents he had drafted, he would assume formal control as managing partner. My role would shift to a generous salary, no signatures, no liability if regulators or creditors came knocking. I could keep my job, just not my authority. In return, he would make the irregular pieces disappear quietly. My hands stayed flat on the table while he talked. I thought about Bethany's warning, about the overnight vendor entries, about my logins showing up while I slept. The same patterns were now in front of me, dressed up as concern. Ethan watched my reaction the way he watched stock prices on his phone, looking for a drop to buy. I told him I would not sign anything that night. I wanted Larry to see whatever he had found and explain where the responsibility really landed. For the first time, the calm surface cracked. Ethan's jaw tightened before he smoothed it over. He said delays could be dangerous. He said evidence had a way of hardening once it reached the wrong eyes. He stood up from the table as if the conversation were finished and thanked me for coming. Then he mentioned a box in the garage that held some of Dad's old records, the kind that might help me feel more confident if I insisted on taking this to Ellery. He made it sound like a concession, a final gesture to show he was acting in good faith. I followed him through the side door and across the short path to the detached garage. The air outside felt heavier than it had when I arrived, as if the humidity itself had thickened. Ethan unlocked the metal door and flipped on the single overhead light. The truck sat where Dad had left it, nose toward the closed bay, dust on the windshield. He pointed toward a shelf near the back wall and said the box I needed was up high. I stepped past him, eyes adjusting to the dim glare, scanning cardboard lids for Dad's handwriting. Behind me, the hinges sighed, the handle dropped. The lock turned with a solid, practiced click that vibrated through my teeth. By the time I spun around, the door was already closed. The strip of light at the bottom narrowed and disappeared. The only sound left in the room was the faint hum of the bulb and my own breathing. Time inside that room slipped out of its usual shape. I stopped knowing how many minutes had passed after the first few times my hands hit the door. At some point, my muscles hurt more than the metal, and the echo in my ears turned into a low, steady roar. No footsteps crossed the floor outside. No hinges creaked. The kind of silence that means no one is coming settled over the garage. Heat pressed up from the concrete. The air held the day's humidity without any breeze to move it. Sweat cooled along my spine and disappeared into the damp. I forced my breathing into counts of 4 in and 4 out, pretending that rhythm meant control. The room itself offered very little. No window, no side door. Just cinderblock walls, shelves of forgotten tools, and Dad's old truck taking up most of the open space. I walked a slow circle along the walls, fingertips brushing seams and bolts, telling myself I might find a flaw if I looked hard enough. There was none. It was easy to picture what Ethan wanted from this. Somewhere beyond that door, he would already be rehearsing his story. His sister overwhelmed, his sister stepping back, his sister not answering calls while he, reluctantly, took charge. He didn't have to make anyone hate me. All he needed was for other people to doubt me and trust him. Fear sharpened when my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. There was no water in sight. No cooler in the corner, no forgotten bottle under a shelf. Jacksonville's heavy air had followed me inside but brought nothing with it. Every breath felt like a withdrawal from a bank I couldn't refill. I threw my shoulder against the door once just to see if anything had changed. Pain bloomed down my arm and across my chest. The lock stayed put. Wishing I were stronger wasn't going to bend steel. So I turned to the one thing in the room that had ever gotten Dad through a problem he couldn't solve with force: his truck. He had driven that pickup long after we could afford newer models. He trusted it because he knew every rattle and stubborn lever. When storms rolled in over the river and phones cut out, he sat in that cab with a map and a radio and sent drivers home the long way around flooded streets. The driver's door was locked. I tugged at it anyway until my fingers hurt, then rested my forehead against the glass and stared at the wheel. It was absurd that a barrier only a few inches wide felt impossible to cross. On the workbench, a rusted wrench waited under a film of dust. It was ugly and solid and exactly what I needed. I wrapped my hand around the handle, walked back to the side window, picked a spot, and swung. The impact snapped through my arms. The glass shattered into a rain of tiny pieces that slid harmlessly across the seat. I brushed shards aside with my sleeve and reached in to flip the lock. The cab smelled like dust and old coffee. The keys were absent, just as I'd expected. I hadn't come for them. My hand moved along the lower dash until it found the radio unit built into the console. The plastic felt warm. Dad had refused to let anyone pull that thing out, even after tracking apps took over. He said it was his backup when the rest of the world failed. For a moment, I just stared at the power switch, as if waiting might somehow charge the battery. Then I pressed it. A small light blinked on. Static spilled into the quiet, thin and uneven, but real. Relief hit so hard I had to close my eyes for a second. Somewhere, electricity still flowed through a line that led beyond this room. I picked up the microphone and pressed the button with my thumb. My breath was too loud in my own ears. There wasn't time to draft a perfect explanation. I said my first name, named the part of town, explained that I was locked inside a garage with no phone and no way out. I kept it simple so I wouldn't run out of strength or courage halfway through. The first response was more static. I turned the dial carefully, moving through channels the way I'd watched Dad do. Pops and hisses came and went. A few random words bled through that had nothing to do with me. The indicator light on the unit grew dimmer at the edges. When I felt the battery fading, I stripped everything down to the bare minimum and pushed the button one more time. Help me. 2 words, no extra detail, launched out into a network I couldn't see. Truckers on night routes, tow operators, hobbyists who refused to give up old equipment. For several long seconds, nothing answered. The cab stayed stale and hot. The radio sputtered. Then a voice slipped through the static and wrapped itself around my name. It was rough, cautious, like the speaker wasn't sure whether this was a prank or a bad dream. Recognition landed in my chest before I could place it. Ethan had once bragged in that same kitchen about driving a man out of our contracts, saying he'd cut dead weight and improved margins. The anger he'd worn that night had stuck with me more than the details. Now that man was the one holding the other end of the signal. I tightened my grip on the microphone as the light on the radio thinned and answered him before the connection could die. The answer on the radio came faster than I expected. The voice cut through the static with enough clarity to prove it was real. He said my name once, with road noise humming behind him, then identified himself. Luke Garner. Years ago, he had hauled freight on Parker routes until Ethan forced him off the schedule. I remembered Ethan bragging about cutting dead weight and how Luke's name had floated at the edge of that story. Luke asked where I was. I told him it was our dad's old place by the river, the detached garage he had always used. No phone, no way out. Luke didn't need an address. He knew the property and said he was close. The indicator light on the unit flickered as he spoke. When it went dark, I kept gripping the microphone long after the static died. I stayed in the cab because stepping down meant admitting the last connection was gone. Eventually, another engine rolled up the driveway, deeper and rougher than Ethan's. Headlights skimmed under the garage door. A door slammed, footsteps crossed the gravel, and metal scraped against the lock. The padlock snapped. The handle turned. Hot Jacksonville air rushed in as the door swung open. Luke stood there in daylight, broader than I remembered, and caught my elbow before I hit the floor. He guided me out without questions that needed more breath than I had. He walked me to his truck and handed over a bottle of water, watching while I took careful sips. Only after my head cleared did he explain why he still listened to that band. After Ethan cut him loose, rumors followed him from shipper to shipper. He kept a scanner on during odd jobs, tow runs, late recoveries, because it was the one line that hadn't been filtered through my brother. When my call came through, he almost dismissed it as noise until he heard the edge underneath. On the drive away from the house, I laid out what I understood about Ethan's plan: the forged patterns in the accounts, the pressure at the kitchen table, the meeting he had scheduled with Ellery. Ethan hadn't only cut Luke's contracts. He had told other clients Luke was unreliable, turning his own manipulation into someone else's stain. Luke said he had filed complaints with a state hotline months earlier. They had treated each incident like an isolated bruise. When he asked where I wanted to go, I said Larry's office. Hospital later, I added, because I could see the argument forming. Luke nodded once and turned toward downtown. He used his hands-free to call Bethany. His summary came out in clipped pieces: forged payments, misuse of my login, a lock on the garage door that was no longer there. Bethany didn't ask him to slow down. She had already pulled logs that didn't match any real invoice and quietly sent them to a financial crimes tip line when Ethan started hovering near her desk. An investigator had called her back, given a name, Sierra Jennings, and asked her to keep documenting. Luke passed the call to me so I could confirm I was conscious and willing to move forward. Bethany's voice steadied when she heard mine. She told me she was bringing everything she had and that investigator Jennings wanted to meet near Ellery's building before Ethan walked in with his version of the truth. We pulled into a side lot a few blocks from Ellery's office. Another sedan eased in behind us. A woman stepped out in plain clothes, badge clipped at her belt, folder under her arm. She introduced herself as Investigator Sierra Jennings and shook my hand with a pressure that checked for steadiness as much as courtesy. Sierra wanted the short sequence first, the kind that could fit on one page. I gave it to her straight. The lunch, the numbers Ethan laid out, the documents he wanted signed, the garage, the radio, Luke cutting the lock. She asked for times, access rights, who held which credentials. Bethany arrived while we talked and laid her folders across the trunk of Luke's truck. Inside those folders were system logs showing Ethan's access trail, copies of transfers that made no business sense, and notes on every time he had requested expanded permissions. Luke had photos on his phone of the broken lock and the inside of the garage. Sierra moved through it all with the focus of someone who had seen too many families turned into leverage. By the time she closed her notebook, she had more than suspicion. She had a pattern that linked my brother's pressure, the missing money, and the door that had closed on me. She told me there would be full statements and a hospital visit later. Right then, we were minutes away from a meeting where Ethan planned to rewrite our father's company on paper. Sierra made a brief call in a clipped tone I recognized from dispatchers approving a route. When she hung up, she turned toward Ellery's building, and the three of us walked with her toward the glass doors. Inside the building, the air felt colder than outside. Ellery's office sat on an upper floor behind a pane of glass that caught the light. His receptionist glanced up as we stepped out of the elevator. Sierra showed her badge, gave her name, and we were directed toward the conference room. Luke walked a half step behind me, Bethany a little to my left, as if we had already chosen our places. The room looked almost identical to the one where Dad's will had been read. Same long table, same quiet paintings, same carafe of water. The difference was two officers along the far wall. Ellery stood near the head, papers in hand, tension in his shoulders. Ethan arrived a moment after us. He opened the door with the ease of someone who expects control. He wore a dark suit and carried a leather folder and a slim drive. His expression changed when he realized I was not missing. His eyes registered Sierra's badge, Luke's stance, Bethany's folders, the uniforms. For once, he had walked into a room that did not belong to him. Ellery said they had waited to begin until everyone necessary was present. Ethan asked why law enforcement was there. Sierra answered with her name, her title, and the fact that she was investigating irregularities tied to Parker Logistics. Her voice stayed level as she laid out what she had. Unauthorized vendor profiles, transfers routed through accounts with no legitimate purpose, use of my credentials when witnesses placed me elsewhere. She described Bethany's records, Luke's history with our roots, the tip line calls, and the lock that was no longer on my father's garage. Ethan tried to frame it as him protecting the company from my mistakes. He said the transfers were temporary fixes and the access requests part of a cleanup. He painted me as overwhelmed and easily influenced by outsiders. He kept reaching for phrases that had worked on clients. They fell flat in that room. Sierra had documents and timestamps. Ellery had already compared signatures he knew too well. The officers moved only after she finished reading the charges she intended to pursue: fraud, forgery, misuse of another person's credentials, unlawful imprisonment. One officer explained the arrest while the other took the drive from Ethan's hand and sealed it. Ethan's jaw clenched. He looked at me as if he still expected me to step between him and the consequences. I did not move. In the weeks that followed, courtrooms replaced conference rooms. There was an arraignment, then hearings where lawyers spoke about my brother in the third person. Sierra's team pulled more data from our servers and matched it to Bethany's saved logs. The pattern held. Luke's earlier complaints, once scattered, became part of a larger record of how Ethan had used rumor and access to push people aside. Eventually, Ethan accepted a plea agreement. He admitted guilt on reduced counts in exchange for a defined sentence and restitution to the company. It was not a dramatic verdict, but it was clear on paper. He went to prison. Under the agreement, he surrendered any role in decisions at Parker Logistics. Whatever stake he kept would be controlled under court supervision, not family negotiation. With Ellery's help, I obtained a restraining order. It covered calls, messages, and indirect contact. The judge who signed it studied the photographs of the garage and the system logs longer than she looked at me. That was enough. If Ethan tried to reach out from his cell block, another file would wait for him. At the office, I worked with an outside accounting firm to rebuild trust. We contacted clients who had heard pieces of the story and gave them a direct version of what had happened. Some stayed. Some left because scandal made them nervous. I let their decisions stand. My job was to keep the company honest, not convince everyone to like me. I did not visit Ethan. I did not answer calls from unfamiliar numbers. Whatever we had been as children ended when he turned our father's building into a trap and expected me to sign away my own name to escape. Cutting him off was not about punishing him. It was about refusing to live in a story he had rewritten for himself. When I think back on all of it, the moment that matters most is not the arrest or the hearings. It is the second in that truck when the radio light flickered and I realized there was still one channel he could not control. That piece of the story stayed mine. So did my decision to believe what I had seen and to trust what people like Bethany and Luke had tried to warn me about. If any part of this feels close to your own life, I hope you find someone solid to talk to before the pattern hardens. Keep records. Listen when the people around you say something is off. And if you never get an apology from the person who hurt you, you still have the right to step away and stay away. Thank you for listening all the way through. If my story made you rethink your boundaries or your idea of family loyalty, you can share it or stay for the next one. Someone else might recognize themselves and decide they deserve better too.